Welcome back to Analysis, where we're looking now at the situation in the Central African Republic. Since the largely Muslim rebel group, the Seleka, ousted President Francois Bozize in March last year, violence has swept across the country. The group split after the coup, but some of its members formed a radical offshoot. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced in the sectarian clashes that followed. Christians form the majority in the Central African Republic, but the situation has become more complicated, with some Christian communities forming anti-Balaka militias, whose members have sought revenge on the country's Muslim minority. An attempted ceasefire between these two groups fell apart only days after it was signed in July this year. Joining us to discuss this are Paul Melly, an associate fellow from the think tank Chatham House, James Schneider, editor-in-chief of Think Africa Press, and Kassim Kayira, a journalist from the BBC. Welcome to you all. But before we begin, let's have a look at this VT report.
The Central African Republic has experienced more than a year of terror and conflict since the partially Muslim Seleka rebels seized power in an attempted coup, prompting the largely Christian anti-Balaka militias to retaliate with deadly force. The Seleka stepped down from power earlier this year and were replaced by an interim civilian government led by President Catherine Samba-Panza. But this didn't stop attacks on Muslims by the anti-Balaka. Thousands of French and African Union forces have been deployed to the country in an attempt to maintain order, and the UN has promised thousands more military personnel and police. But these have yet to appear, and violence continues. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims across the country were driven away from their homes and towns, with estimates of some 650,000 being internally displaced and another 300,000 fleeing to neighbouring countries. So when news of a ceasefire broke last month, it was hoped that the country could start its way to recovery and the disarmament of fighting factions. Financial support pledged from both the EU and the USA totals nearly $200 million. Unfortunately, the ceasefire didn't last, and at least 22 people were killed in clashes last week. The ceasefire was announced towards the end of Ramadan, and as the remaining Muslims in the country celebrated the holy month's end, they complained of a complete lack of attention from the interim government.
Even in the US, Barack Obama wished Muslims a happy Ramadan. Even the militants in Israel did the same. But here, not even the president nor the government wished a happy Ramadan to Muslims, which means nobody cares for us.
So what chance for peace in the country? Can the ceasefire be revived? Octavia Bell, Islam Channel.
Well, Kassim Kayira, let me begin with you. Why did the ceasefire actually break down?
I think there were about three reasons, personally, that I think that made the ceasefire not to work. The first one was the fact that the ceasefire was hastily put together. Not enough consultation had gone down the road to sort of prepare for the ceasefire. President Denis Sassou Nguesso has been under a lot of pressure to sort of come up with a deal. Internationally, there's been a lot of voicing and the need for a ceasefire, but not enough time had gone into that. The second thing is that of the Seleka representation, the Seleka is a coalition of so many different groups. The people that went to Brazzaville to sign this particular ceasefire were not necessarily fully representing the Seleka. So some groups back in CAR felt that they had been left behind. They had not been consulted, especially on the very crucial point which had been put up by Seleka of dividing the two countries, having a Muslim north and a Christian south, which was, of course, was the only way that the ceasefire was signed when they said they were no longer pushing for this. Many of the groups back in CAR still wanted to push for that, using South Sudan as an example that if it had happened in South Sudan where it broke away from Sudan, then they don't see any reason as to why an amicable way of sort of parting ways could not happen. The third thing was the fact that the parties to this particular ceasefire, whether there was enough commitment, and that goes to the very first point, which is about the preparation, the manner in which it was done, looking ahead to September when we are expecting the peacekeepers, international peacekeepers, to get into CAR, I think it could have worked a lot better with the peacekeepers being in place. That is how I view it. Probably there could have been some other reasons.
Well, Paul, let me talk to you about the partition thing. I mean, Kassim's explained why it didn't work, but I mean, is that a viable idea in general? Would it involve a lot of transfer of population between the two new entities if there were partition?
It would be very difficult because actually the CAR isn't a country that's developed with a traditionally Muslim North, Christian South divide with some sort of simply drawn line on the map. There are very many communities, very many towns, villages even, where there are both communities present. And the current line of partition or rough military balance between the areas where the Anti-Balaka are dominant and the areas where the Seleka are dominant don't even fit exactly with those sort of, even with the preponderance of populations from different groups. And people haven't necessarily traditionally identified themselves primarily as either Muslim or Christian. For very many years, it was a much more secondary and incidental point, just part of someone's makeup. And also, the military groups on both sides aren't fully representative of the population as a whole. They haven't grown out of what you might call normal political movements. They haven't grown out of some long tradition of political groups campaigning for something and then finding that they couldn't get it, and so taking up arms. And very many of the Muslim groups are effectively led by warlords, some of them foreigners, not all, but some of them foreigners, and some of the fighters have come in from other countries, such as Sudan. And very many of the Anti-Balaka groups are really a rather vicious, nasty, sectarian, short-term reaction that's come out of the very, very incendiary rhetoric, hatred rhetoric that's got stirred up over the last year or so, and again, don't really claim any legitimacy. And meanwhile, almost the entire political class, as one hitherto thought of it in the CAR, has been absent, partly because many people, many politicians, their families have been intimidated and nobody wants to speak out. So there isn't really anyone with much legitimacy to make a deal in the normal sense of what you might call a peace accord.
And James, I mean, the Christian majority would never accept partition, would they? So it is a non-starter, isn't it?
And for the reasons Paul was saying, it is a complete nonsense. It doesn't map onto the country's geography, history, ethnic makeup. It really is just a representation of the fact that in one part of the north there is a separate militia control which is separate from the government. It's not, I don't think it should be thought of as a kind of in any way credible plan, or even that the Seleka or ex-Seleka are necessarily thinking about it as their viable way forward. I think the way that the negotiators were using it in Brazzaville was as a negotiating plank, as a way to get further their demands, because it's something which is obviously unacceptable, which they can then give away. I don't think it's a viable possibility.
Well, Kasim, I mean, you mentioned that the troops are coming in September, beefing up the French and the AU forces. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think there's a chance that they could bring about a more permanent ceasefire?
I think it is so dependent on the conditions on the ground, and it has to start with the people of CAR themselves, whether they are ready to make a change. Peacekeepers can only keep the peace, actually. In the absence of peace, there's hardly anything that they can be able to do in the current circumstances. Like James and Paul were actually mentioning, speaking to many people in CAR, the ordinary citizens, the issue of partition is not really anywhere on their agendas. It's something that has been floated and actually very recent. It's even a very recent phenomenon, not even at the start of the problems. It was used as part of the negotiating tactics for the people in the north, especially because it was, well, much of CAR is underdeveloped, but the north is even more underdeveloped in comparison to the rest of CAR. So the idea was, can you create a certain sense of autonomy, sort of semi-autonomous region in the north that would allow people to have access to this? These are the sort of discussions that people are having. But until they are ready as CAR people to sort of face up to the future, be ready to have peace, then I think it makes it very difficult for peacekeepers to actually keep the peace.
I think it's that, but it's even more difficult than that. It's until all the different bits within the Seleka Rebel Alliance are willing to have the same platform and to agree on the same common set. Because as Kasim was saying in his opening response, the reason why the ceasefire was totally stillborn, when it was announced, there were already statements from different elements of Seleka saying that they weren't respecting it. And even if you look at the signature page on the ceasefire document itself, the representative supposedly from the Seleka was signing actually on behalf of his militia, which is one of the constituent militias of Seleka. So the people of CAR need to, be ready to decide on the peace, but also you've got these different competing warlords who have some overarching interest together as Seleka, but they could go their separate ways, and that's very difficult to manage.
Well, what do you think the peacekeeping forces, the extra peacekeeping forces, should do when they arrive?
Well, there's obviously one thing they can do, which is simply display more of the serious muscle that the current French and African forces are already showing. That won't stop all violence, but obviously it does have some contribution to stability when you have people who are properly trained, have proper equipment, have heavy weapons, have armoured vehicles, and show, as it were, that they are in charge. And if there are moments of flashpoint where individual small groups of gunmen take them on, they're sort of faced down by people in a professional but serious manner. But it's not going to be possible for them physically to impose peace on the whole country. As Kassim was pointing out, this is a very, very diverse, huge, widely scattered place. The territory is absolutely enormous. And it's also complicated because the area where Seleka are still in charge, because at this stage the international forces haven't managed to push that far, is the area where the diamonds are. And of course diamonds, even with the Kimberley process attempt at controlling international diamond trade, basically diamonds are portable money, and in the CAR they are alluvial, so they're dug out of riverbeds. You don't need to have huge commercial mines or a lot of equipment. And so behind all the ethnic and social and military factors, you've got the fact that at the moment quite a number of Seleka warlords are sitting on revenue generators that can allow them to buy weapons, ship money out of the country, and it wouldn't be surprising if they then started resisting very hard any effort to push international control further. In some ways, a key test may be whether it's the current international forces or whether it's the beefed up with the UN presence, when the sort of harder edges of the international forces try to push into towns such as Bria, the center of the diamond mining industry, or Wada, further north where there are more mines, in those areas, that in a sense will be a test of how far Seleka commanders and warlords are prepared to fight to protect their vested interests.
But do you think the peacekeeping forces should try and go into those areas, or should they just leave them for the moment?
Well, eventually they're going to need to, because the warlords don't have any legitimacy. It's not as if the CAR had had a series of elections where groups, parties, if you like, movements had come to the fore out of some sort of political legitimacy and then later taken up arms. These are men with guns who have then played on certain traditional familial or ethnic allegiances sometimes to mobilize more force, but quite a lot of them are mercenaries, people with very little legitimacy at all. Equally, the anti-Balaka can't be said to command. You can't say that all the Christians in the CAR believe in genocidal hate violence, but obviously the anti-Balaka have some degree of force. But
Kassim, what is the prospect for elections? Would elections have any validity or value at this stage?
That was my worry, because last week I think I had a sort of a lengthy chat with the CAR Minister of Infrastructure, and we were talking exactly about the viability of elections next year, and he was telling me that the minimum period the interim government would need would be about 3 years to sort of assert itself. Because part of what Paul was mentioning about militias sort of being able to run sort of mineral-rich areas, even the government to date has been unable to collect any revenue from its own minerals, because there were deals that were signed in the past that the government would wish to re-sign, to sort of renegotiate now, because they were not done in good faith, and therefore the money is ending up in individual pockets instead of ending up in government coffers. So where the rebels are running their own sort of mini-state in terms of collection of this money from minerals, even within the government itself, they've been unable to raise money because the deals that were signed before were actually not signed well, and they would want to renegotiate that. But the government does not have the clout to be able to renegotiate that.
Does the government have Muslim ministers in it? Is it
about two, I think, yeah, which they still feel
some
is
genuine
quite small.
coalition national unity government, or is it basically just a Christian
Not
government?
many people, and I think from the clip that was played, you saw that, you know, the president was supposed to play, you know, into Ramadan, you know, sort of sending and wishing a message to the country, to the Muslims who are fasting. Those small things sort of ignite, you know, emotions within people. It is still a very fragile situation that anything that you do and everything that you say will be interpreted in one way or another. So yes, elections can be carried out. That is to the satisfaction of the international community, which normally wants that to happen very fast. But whether it would achieve a sort of a Mali sort of result is totally different. It's going to be truly difficult.
But the peacekeeping forces, I mean, at least in the capital in Bangui, have stopped the ethnic cleansing and the massacres, haven't they? So they have, some progress has been made, surely.
Yes, but I mean, after massive areas of the city have been entirely cleared of people, there are still people essentially under siege within their own communities. I mean, the amount of violence has decreased. But I mean, even today there was fighting between French forces and Seleka militia. So it's not as if
in Bangui.
In Bangui, yeah. So it's not as if total quiet has. It's not as if total quiet's returned.
And near the airport, there was a whole refugees community, wasn't there? Is that still there?
That's still there, isn't
That's
it?
still
yeah,
there,
yeah,
yes. That's still there, and that is causing a lot of problems because the UNHCR has been asking the French, for example, to sort of, you know, make sure that these people can actually be moved probably to a safer location, but being by the airport, it's 100,000 people. It's
Muslims.
100, no, they are Christians.
They are Christians.
And it has been used as a base to attack because this area is just near Pekasenk, which is the predominantly Muslim area, and it's very near the airport as well. So people from the camp easily go and attack these areas. They come back very quickly, and these people can't revenge. So it has been quite a serious point of concern, and they've been asking, even UNHCR saying, we cannot provide services in a sort of a makeshift refugee camp. We need these people to be in a particular area where we can look after them.
I mean, we saw in the clip, on the Ramadan point, we saw people praying in the clip. I mean, are they protected by French troops or AU
it's
forces?
Burundi troops. It's Burundi and Rwandan troops who run that particular area. That's Pekasenk, where the main mosque is. But it's very near the airport as well, where 100,000 predominantly Christian who took refuge there when the Selekas took power in March 2013. They were running, they were fleeing for their lives, but it has become now a source of serious concern. It's difficult for some NGOs to go and work inside there because there are weapons there. We were able to establish that there were guns in that particular camp.
And
that
people
makes
have
it
not
difficult.
been able to go back to their homes at all. They're all burnt down, I think.
No, they can't go back to their homes. They don't feel safe as well. So unless they are moved to another place where they can feel particularly comfortable, I think it is still very difficult. But other areas like Pekaduz, which is the predominantly difficult area just trying to get out of the capital, this is where most attacks have come in. And where peacekeepers have gone in, they've not been able to manage this particular place. It's 12 kilometers from the town. It's very, very dangerous.
So what would your advice be for the new peacekeeping forces? What should they concentrate on, since they can't do everything, obviously?
They've got to try as much as they can to engage in disarmament campaigns, which is going to be extremely difficult. In the same way that the Seleka are not going to want to lose their bits of economic control, that they're going to have likewise different anti-Balaka gangs which may have erected checkpoints on the streets and are getting some sort of revenue from that, are not going to want to withdraw those. But I think all the peacekeepers can do is try to create some kind of space for then other solutions to come through. And hopefully that solution doesn't end with a hastily, either a hasty transitional bringing everyone together entity or a hasty election. Because the problem that the CAR has, I think, on the political level is they've got to avoid two things. They've got to avoid providing too much political power to those who have caused the violence that has been going through the country and not give power to warlords. But also at the same time, there's a political elite that totally failed beforehand that they don't want to re-empower. So it's going to be a very difficult position for the peacekeepers, but I mean, at least they will be able to provide some space for others to then act.
Is there a risk that there could be a hasty withdrawal? That at the moment there are new peacekeeping forces coming, but let's say in 6 months' time, not much has changed. Will the French and the people who are funding the AU, which is reliant on international help, just say, "Well, it's too much. We can't go on with this. We've tried, but it's no good," and start pulling out?
I don't think so. I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago talking to policymakers, and they were emphatic that although France would like to eventually withdraw from the CAR, unlike West Africa and the Sahel where the presence is permanent, they won't do so until the UN reckons that it's sufficiently strong and sufficiently well embedded and well resourced to manage without the French forces. And I think that could be a long way off, in the sense that because the French aren't actually going to be inside the UN force, they will have the power to act in a rather muscular way. And there's an interesting example that we've seen in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's the main UN force, and then on the side of it is an African force, the Force Intervention Brigade, which is empowered, mandated to operate in a much more aggressive way against armed groups. And one could imagine the French being left, as it were, to take on that type of role, where warlords won't cooperate, if you like, or start committing new genocidal abuses or whatever. So I think the French are probably prepared to stick it out for quite some time, and they've also fought a very tough battle in the European Union to get EU troops into the third. There's a third force in the CAR helping the international force. It's a small EU force, and that, although the soldiers in it are only half French, it was a really tough political battle for President Hollande to get the rest of the EU to accept and agree to this operation. So they won't want to give that up lightly, and Europe as a whole is funding operations.
I think we're unfortunately coming to the end of time. Thank you very much indeed. We've now come to the end of this episode of Analysis. I'd like to thank you all, guests, and of course you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget you can keep up with us by following on Twitter at the address below, or by following Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, thank you all. Goodbye.